We always talk about type 2 diabetes, and it seems like, I don't know, it's the same stuff, right? Diet, exercise,
Yeah.
getting older. But
Yeah.
what if that's not the whole story? I mean, what if there's something else going on deeper, like in our cells and all
Right.
that?
That's a really interesting question, and that's kind of what we're going to dive into today.
Yeah, that's what we're talking about today. We're looking at some really, really fascinating research that is kind of changing the way we think about type 2 diabetes.
Exactly. We're looking beyond the risk factors that we think about. So we're not going to talk so much about diet and exercise, but rather what might be actually causing this at a really fundamental biological level.
And at the heart of it all, we're talking about mitochondria.
Oh, yeah.
Remember those?
The powerhouse.
From like high school biology, powerhouses of the cell. So there's this amazing study that came out of the University of Michigan, got published in Science, one of the biggest, most well-respected journals out there. And it's showing this really unexpected link between those mitochondria and type 2 diabetes developing.
Yeah, it's pretty groundbreaking stuff. What they're finding is that the problems in the mitochondria might not just be a consequence of the disease, they might actually be one of the things that causes it in the first place.
So what we're going to do today is break it all down, look at this study, try to figure out what it all means, for how we think about type 2 diabetes, how we might treat it down the road.
Yeah, it's like getting a sneak peek into the inner workings of our cells and how this disease really takes hold.
Okay, so let's back up for a sec. For those who, maybe don't remember high school biology quite as well, mitochondria, powerhouses of the cell. But why are they so important? Why do we care about them when we're talking about type 2 diabetes, and in particular, those insulin-producing beta cells in the pancreas?
So those beta cells have a really critical job, right? They make insulin, and insulin is the hormone that helps control our blood sugar.
Right.
But just like any kind of factory, they need a power source to make that insulin, and that's where the mitochondria come in. They provide all the energy that those beta cells need to produce and then, release the insulin to keep everything running smoothly. So if those mitochondria aren't working properly, the beta cells are going to struggle to keep up with the body's demands.
So if the power's out, the factory can't run. I get it. And the study mentions this whole thing about mitochondria sending out a stress signal when things aren't going well.
Yeah.
What's that all about?
Well, here's what's fascinating. When mitochondria get damaged or they start to malfunction, they don't just, quietly give up.
Right.
They actually send out these distress signals, kind of like a mayday call within the cell. And this is where things get really interesting, because what the University of Michigan researchers discovered is that this stress signal triggers a whole cascade of events. It can cause the beta cells to actually lose their specialized identity and stop producing insulin. So this suggests that problems with mitochondria could be a very early and active driver of type 2 diabetes, not just a side effect.
Wow. So it's almost like they're forgetting who they are and what they're supposed to be doing.
Right.
Because they're so stressed out.
Yeah.
And the researchers actually looked at tissue from people who had type 2 diabetes to see if this was happening in humans, right? Not just in a petri dish.
Yes, exactly. They wanted to see if this was happening in real life. So they looked at pancreatic tissue from people with type 2 diabetes, and they found real evidence of this mitochondrial dysfunction happening. So specifically, what they saw was that there were fewer copies of mitochondrial DNA in the beta cells. And think of DNA as like the instruction manual for building healthy mitochondria. So fewer copies means fewer healthy mitochondria.
It's fewer instruction manuals, fewer powerhouses to build. Makes sense.
Exactly. They also noticed that there was less activity in genes that are involved in energy production, which means the existing mitochondria weren't working as efficiently as they should be.
Oh, so not only were there fewer of them, but the ones that were there weren't pulling their weight.
Right, exactly. And you mentioned earlier this idea of impaired maintenance.
Yeah, that was a kind of a big one in there, this cleanup process.
Yeah. So there's a cellular process called mitophagy. It's kind of like the cell's recycling system. It gets rid of damaged or worn out mitochondria.
Okay.
And what they found in the diabetic tissue was that this mitophagy process wasn't working as well, leading to a buildup of dysfunctional mitochondria. And this accumulation, it kind of creates a vicious cycle, putting even more stress on the cells.
So it's not just that you're not building new healthy powerhouses, but the old busted ones are piling up.
That's exactly right.
Gotcha. Okay. So how did the scientists prove that these mitochondrial problems were actually causing the diabetes and not just a side effect of having it?
So that's where they used mouse models. What they did was they engineered mice to have specific types of mitochondrial defects.
Hmm.
Different groups of mice, different defects. And the key finding was that in every single one of these mouse models, the same integrated stress response, or ISR, was activated.
Okay, and remind me, that ISR, that's that stress signal that we're talking about, the one that basically tells the beta cells to kind of forget what they're doing.
You got it. And what they showed was that when this ISR is turned on for a long period of time, because of all this stress from the mitochondria, it essentially silences the genes that those beta cells need to stay healthy and keep producing insulin. It's almost like the cells are so overwhelmed by the stress that they can't do their job anymore.
It's like they're drowning in stress and they just can't function. So it sounds like a very specific targeted breakdown happening right there in the cell. But this study hinted that maybe it's not just a pancreas problem. It could be bigger than that.
That's a really crucial point. They also observed this pattern of mitochondrial dysfunction, so fewer copies of that mitochondrial DNA, and signs of stress in other tissues that are involved in type 2 diabetes. So we're talking about the liver, fat tissue. This suggests that this might be a more systemic issue, contributing to insulin resistance, where the body's cells aren't responding to insulin the way they should, and just throwing the whole metabolic system out of whack.
Right, so if the energy production is compromised in all these key places, the liver, fat tissue, it could have major ripple effects. And Dr. Scott Solomonpour, one of the researchers, he had a quote that really drove this point home.
Yeah, he said, losing your beta cells is the most direct path to getting type 2 diabetes. Through our study, we now have an explanation for what might be happening and how we might intervene.
Which is a great segue. How do we intervene? Let's talk about this ISRIB molecule. What is that, and how does it fit into this whole story?
Okay, so ISRIB stands for Integrated Stress Response Inhibitor, and it does exactly what its name suggests. It blocks that stress signaling pathway, that ISR that we've been talking about. And remember, that pathway gets activated when the mitochondria aren't working properly. So in the study, when they gave ISRIB to the mice that had those mitochondrial defects, it stopped those important beta cell genes from being silenced.
So it's like hitting the pause button on the stress response, giving the cells a chance to regroup and get back to work.
Precisely. By blocking the ISRIB essentially allowed the beta cells to keep their identity and keep making insulin, even though their mitochondria were still having problems.
Wow. So is this something that people are using now to treat diabetes?
Not yet. It's still experimental, but it's currently being studied in clinical trials for other conditions where cellular stress is a big factor, things like neurological disorders and some age-related diseases. But this study makes a really strong case for looking at ISRIB, or maybe other therapies that work in a similar way, as a potential treatment for type 2 diabetes in the future. It's really exciting to think about addressing the disease at such a fundamental level.
It's like you're going right to the source of the problem.
Yeah.
And Dr. Spring Beruz, another one of the researchers, had a great quote about the broader significance of all this.
Yeah, she said, this data suggests that early mitochondrial dysfunction actively contributes to the disease and potentially impacts other tissues. And that really underscores the idea that type 2 diabetes might not just be about lifestyle factors over time, but could have deep roots in how our cells, especially their mitochondria, function and deal with stress as we get older.
So maybe it's not just about how many donuts you eat.
Right.
It's about, like, what's happening on a microscopic level.
Yeah, it's about the aging process itself.
So the hope is that if we can target those early changes in the mitochondria, we might be able to actually prevent the problem before it even starts.
Right.
Or maybe even reverse it if it's already underway, instead of just managing high blood sugar after the fact.
Exactly. This research opens up a whole new way of thinking about treatment. It's not just about managing the symptoms, it's about going after the root cause of the problem.
Now, obviously, we need more research, especially in humans, to really understand what this all means, but it does paint a pretty compelling picture. These tiny powerhouses in our cells could hold the key to cracking the code on type 2 diabetes.
Absolutely. These findings are a huge step forward. They're telling us that if we can keep our mitochondria healthy or find ways to effectively block those stress signals, we could revolutionize how we treat this disease.
So what should our listeners take away from all this? Well, first of all, type 2 diabetes, it's not just about lifestyle. It might start much deeper, with problems in those mitochondria, those little energy factories in our cells.
And this new understanding gives us a lot to be hopeful about. It suggests that future treatments could target those fundamental processes within the cells, giving us a much more powerful and effective way to fight this global health challenge.
It really makes you think. If our cells are aging, if those little power plants inside them are breaking down, understanding how and why that happens could be crucial, not just for diabetes, but for our health in general. Maybe taking care of our mitochondria will become a key part of staying healthy as we get older. It's definitely something to ponder.
Food for thought.
Food for thought, for sure. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
My pleasure.
I'll see you next time.
See you then.